Hello there, dear listener. I'm truly glad you're here. How has your day been? Whether it was long or calm, filled with work or quiet moments, I hope now is a time you can gently set everything aside and simply be. Tonight, as you settle in, perhaps under a soft blanket, with a warm drink nearby, or just the steady rhythm of your own breath, I invite you into a space of calm stories, whispered memories, and the quiet comfort of imagination. Have you ever wondered how the very first piece of fabric came to be? Or where the first spark of creativity bloomed in ancient hands? If you enjoy stories rooted in forgotten history, soothing folk tales, or peaceful legends from faraway times, this space was made for you. I'd love to know, what kinds of stories do you enjoy most? Soft tales from ancient villages? Forgotten inventions? Gentle mysteries wrapped in time? Let me know in the comments, or leave a like to show you're here. Your thoughts help shape the stories to come, and your presence means more than you know. Now, if you're ready, let's begin our journey together with the tale of a young girl named Lyra and the dream that would one day become the very first cloth the world had ever known. This is Chapter 1 of The Thread of Lyra, a gentle triumph of the world's first cloth. Take a deep breath and let the story carry you. Long before history was carved into stone, before ink kissed paper, before humans wore the comfort of woven cloth, there was a valley. It was not marked on any map, for no maps existed. It was known simply by the rustle of trees and the song of water. Birds called it home, and deer passed through it like quiet spirits. The people who lived there did not name the valley, because names, back then, were not yet so important. They lived where the wind chose to rest, where sunlight trickled through tall leaves like golden threads falling from the sky. And in that valley lived a girl named Lyra. She was not strong like the hunters, nor quick like the gatherers. Her steps were soft, and her voice softer still. She liked quiet places and things that others overlooked. The curl of a fern, the shimmer on a dragonfly's wing, the way two strands of grass could twist around each other in the breeze. While others prepared meals and sharpened tools, Lyra would sit by the stream that murmured through the valley's heart. She would let her feet dip into the cool water, and her fingers play with the fibers of plants, gently, curiously, as though the plants had secrets they might whisper back if she listened long enough. She had one simple question that she carried quietly in her heart. What if softness could be made? What if warmth didn't need to come from fur or fire, but from something gentler, made with care? Each evening, when the sun fell behind the distant trees and the sky turned the color of warm ash, the people of the valley would gather by the fire. They told stories of the spirits of the forest, of the stars above, of the brave and the bold. But Lyra sat a little apart. Her hands were always busy, twisting, braiding, testing. She had discovered something that no one else had noticed. The bark of the flax tree peeled into long, silvery threads when soaked in water and left beneath the moonlight. The stems of dried nettles, though coarse at first, could be softened with time. Even the inner fibers of old leaves, when teased apart, could be smoothed into something like string. Lyra began to gather these fibers as if they were treasures. She laid them under flat stones near the stream to soften. She spun them gently with her fingers, one over the other, like whisper joining whisper. No one told her to do it. No one knew why she did it. But each night, as the world grew still, a few more inches of thread had been born beneath her quiet hands. Time passed slowly in the valley, as it often does in peaceful places. The seasons moved like stories told around firelight. Summer came with lazy bees and heavy fruit. Autumn dressed the trees in quiet gold. Winter whispered hush to all things, and spring awoke them again. And through it all, Lyra spun. Her fingertips grew nimble. Her hands remembered the rhythm of twist and pull, of wet and dry, of waiting and working. And little by little, her thread became longer, finer, softer. But still, she did not know what it was for. She only knew that it felt right. One morning, just as the mist was lifting from the valley floor, Lyra saw something that changed everything. It was a bird, small and gray, caught in a bramble. Its wing was tangled in an old net of vines. The creature trembled, eyes wide with fear, unable to fly. Lyra moved carefully, whispering softly, as if her breath could soothe. She cut the vines with a stone blade and freed the bird. But its wing hung at an angle, broken. She held it gently, wrapping her fingers around its body, and thought, "What can I do? What can I give it?" And then, like the wind answering a silent wish, she knew. She returned to her shelter and took a length of her thread, the softest she had ever spun. With careful fingers, she began to wrap it, layer by layer, around the bird's wing. Not tightly, just enough to support, to hold, to comfort. It was not perfect, it was not fast, but it was something no one had done before. She cradled the bird
through night, letting her warmth become its warmth, letting her silence be a cradle. And when morning came, the bird still breathed, and the thread still held. That day, Lyra understood. Thread was more than thread. It could be care. It could be kindness. It could be home. She began to dream bigger. Could thread become cloth? Could many strands, woven like branches in a nest, become something that warmed more than wings? Something that touched the skin like comfort, like memory? And so began her quiet quest, not to conquer, not to be praised, but to weave warmth from the wild, to spin a gift from the plants, the stream, the silence. She did not know that someday the world would call it cloth. To her, it was simply love, drawn long and soft through time. And the valley where the wind slept, it began to whisper her name, Lyra. The moon that hung over the valley was not just a silent watcher in the sky. It was Lyra's quiet companion. When others dreamed in their sleep, Lyra dreamed with her eyes open, under silver light, her fingers gently working by the soft lull of the stream. Nights were her sanctuary. There were no loud footsteps, no laughter, no clatter of stone tools. Only the hush of leaves shifting, the tiny sounds of nocturnal life, and the steady rhythm of her breath as she spun and twisted. She no longer gathered fibers only from flax or nettle. Her eyes had grown sharper, her sense more attuned. She began to see fibers in places no one else thought to look. The bark of fallen saplings, the silky inner threads of milkweed, even the fine tendrils that held seed pods to their stems. Each offered something, a promise, small and subtle. Lyra didn't take much, only what was ready to be given. She thanked every plant in her own quiet way. Sometimes a soft word, sometimes a gentle press of her palm to leaf or root.
Over time, the little shelter where she slept began to change. Once just a curve of woven branches and dried grass, it was now lined with bundles of drying fibers, with loops of hand-spun thread hanging from sticks above her sleeping mat. Some were coarse, some soft, some nearly invisible in the dark. And yet it still wasn't cloth. Thread she had, miles of it. But weaving, truly weaving, was a mystery she hadn't solved. One evening, as twilight brushed the treetops and birds called their final notes of the day, Lyra sat by the stream and began to dream aloud. What if, she whispered, the threads could cross, not only twist? What if they could hold each other, not in a line, but in a net of gentleness? She tried. She laid out thin lengths of thread across 2 sticks and began weaving others through, over and under, back and forth. At first, it came loose. The thread slipped, the pattern broke. But she smiled softly. There was no rush. Even the trees grew slowly. Even the moon changed in patient circles. So she tried again, and again. Each night, she wove a little more. She found ways to tighten the cross threads with little knots. She discovered that moistening the fibers helped them cling before drying into strength. Her fingers moved like dancers, hesitant at first, then with grace. Some days she didn't speak a word to anyone, but in her silence she created something new. Soon her first patch of cloth was no larger than her hand, but when she held it up in the morning sun, it glowed faintly, golden and green, like a piece of the valley itself held together in her palms. It was imperfect, but it was real, and Lyra, for the first time, wept, not from sadness, but from the gentle overwhelming of having touched something beautiful, something born of her own patience and love. One morning, a woman from the village named Noma came to fetch water and noticed Lyra rinsing her woven cloth in the stream. "What's that?" she asked, peering curiously. Lyra hesitated. Her instinct was to hide it, not because it was a secret, but because it felt sacred, like something too soft to show too soon. "It's a piece of thread, but many threads together," she said, searching for words that had not yet been named. Noma touched it, lifting a corner with calloused fingers. Her brow furrowed. "It's soft," she said, "like animal fur, but not." Lyra nodded slowly. Noma handed it back, shrugged, and continued with her task. "Strange," she murmured, "but beautiful." It wasn't praise exactly, but it wasn't dismissal either. That night, Lyra sat beside her tiny fire, wrapped in thought. She gazed at the stars above and wondered, will others ever want this softness? Will it ever matter to anyone but me? And from the branches above, the small bird she had once saved now sat watching. Its wing had healed, it could fly, and yet it returned often, quietly, faithfully. Sometimes it brought her small gifts, a feather, a berry, a glinting stone, a thank you, perhaps. One evening, as the moon climbed high, Lyra laid out her small patches of cloth beside her. There were 5 now, each one a little better than the last. She began to stitch them together using her own thread as cord. Not fast, not perfect, but slowly, steadily, a larger piece was born. Something that could cover a shoulder, warm a child, soften a sleeping mat. She pressed the cloth to her cheek, and for the first time she felt comfort made by human hands. The next morning, the children of the valley came running past her hut on their way to collect berries. One of them stopped, pointing at the cloth spread on a stone to dry. "What is that?" the boy asked. Lyra smiled. "A kind of blanket," she replied, "but made from plants." "Can I touch it?" She nodded. He reached out, slowly, as though touching something magical. His eyes widened. "It feels like the wind and the sun mixed together." Lyra's eyes softened. That's what I hoped. The children ran on, but the boy turned back once and waved. She waved too, her hands stained with plant dye, her nails rough, but her heart quietly full. That night, Lyra placed the cloth over her own shoulders as the evening chill settled in. It held warmth, not just from her fire, but from her time, her care, her wondering. And as the stars blinked into being above, she whispered to the sky, "I think this is only the beginning." And the valley answered with a breeze soft as spun thread, and moonlight like a gentle promise. The first winds of early autumn rolled gently through the valley, brushing the tall grass in waves that looked like the sea. Leaves whispered of change, but in a language only the patient could hear. Lyra listened, always. Each day, the sun rose slower now, and mist lingered longer over the earth. In that quiet chill between night and day, Lyra worked. Her hands were no longer clumsy or unsure. They moved with the quiet authority of one who had learned from the earth, not from books or words, but from watching, failing, waiting. Her latest creation, a piece of cloth larger than any she had made before, now lay spread over a rock warmed by the afternoon sun. Its color was not uniform, pale green in some places, golden tan in others. It was uneven, but it was real, strong, soft, kind to the touch. She called it the blanket of morning light. Though she hadn't named it aloud, the name lived in her thoughts, because that was what it reminded her of, how the valley looked at dawn, when fog kissed the fields, and the light hadn't yet made up its mind whether to be silver or gold. One morning, as she folded the blanket and held it close, she heard soft footsteps behind her. It was Noma again, this time with her young daughter, Ina, who clung shyly to her mother's leg. "She hasn't been sleeping well," Noma said, her voice low. "The cold makes her restless." Lyra said nothing. She simply looked down at the cloth in her hands, then back at the child's tired eyes. Without a word, she folded the blanket and passed it into Noma's arms. "Oh no, I couldn't," Noma began. But Lyra only smiled, and that was answer enough. That night, under the canopy of stars, Ina curled up in her mother's lap, wrapped in the blanket of morning light. For the first time in many moons, her breathing slowed quickly. Her small shoulders relaxed. Sleep came like a tide. Noma returned the next day, not with words, but with roots from her garden and berries picked with care. Lyra accepted them, and they sat together quietly for a while. No need to speak when the wind did all the talking. It was not long before word began to travel. Quiet word, gentle word. No one shouted about Lyra's cloth. There were no grand proclamations, but one by one, villagers came. An old man whose knees ached asked for something to wrap around them. A new mother wanted a soft mat for her baby. A young hunter returned from the forest with a rabbit pelt and asked, "Can your thread be joined with fur?" Each request was humble. Each gift Lyra gave was simpler than it looked. But behind every stitch, every knot, every weave was care. She made cloth not for trade, not for power. She made it as one might sing a lullaby or build a fire on a cold morning. To give comfort, to quiet the ache, to slow the world down just enough for someone to rest. By the time the first frost painted the edges of leaves, her cloth had become known in the valley as Lyra's soft wind, a name not chosen by her, but whispered from one person to another, like something sacred. She wove through the winter, too, beneath her little shelter of branches and hide, firelight flickering beside her. Sometimes she used her breath to warm her fingers when they grew stiff. Sometimes the bird from before, whom she had named Tuya, brought her dry grass for padding. She wove as snow fell. She wove as wind howled. And through the dark, long nights, her spirit stayed gentle and steady. One evening, the elder of the valley came to visit. His name was Balun, and he rarely left his fire ring any more. But word of Lyra's gift had reached even his ears. He sat with her a long time before speaking. "I've lived through many winters," he said slowly, "and seen many changes. But this thing you make, it is not just useful. It is a kindness made real." Lyra lowered her gaze, not from shame, but from the weight of hearing what she'd only ever felt. "I only wanted to help," she murmured. "And that," Balun said, "is why it matters." He stayed until her pot of nettle tea grew cold. Before he left, he placed something in her palm. A small carved stone, worn smooth with age, shaped like the sun. "This," he said, "was given to me when I was young by a healer who used nothing but herbs and lullabies. She told me, 'What the world forgets, the gentle will remember.' You remind me of her." Lyra held the stone close to her heart, tears warm against her cheeks. As spring whispered its return and snow melted into streams again, the valley began to bloom, not only with flowers, but with woven things. Cloth strips tied to walking sticks, blankets folded at sleeping places, clothing patched with Lyra's thread, even if just a few lines. Her gift had become part of them, woven not just into garments, but into their lives. And as for Lyra, she continued, quietly, steadily, not seeking greatness, but offering warmth. A single soul with gentle hands who had taken fibers from forgotten plants and turned them into care. Each evening, as the sun dipped below the hills, she watched the sky turn gold, then pink, then deep blue. And with her cup of tea, she'd whisper to herself, "Softness can change the world, one thread at a time." And far above, stars blinked their silent agreement. The days grew warmer once more. Tiny buds peeked shyly from the ends of the branches, as if asking the sky for permission to bloom. Birds returned to their morning songs, each note soft as a breath. And in the heart of it all, Lyra kept weaving. The village no longer needed to ask who she was. Her name was carried not by loud tales, but by quiet gratitude. And yet, something inside Lyra stirred. It wasn't restlessness, it wasn't ambition. It was more like the feeling of a stream that has lingered long in a quiet pool, sensing the pull of a current beyond, gentle yet steady. She had given her cloth to the valley, but what of the hills beyond? What of the people she had never met, who might also be cold or weary or simply in need of softness? One morning, as dew still clung to the grass and the air smelled of damp earth, a boy arrived at her hut. He could not have been more than 12 seasons old, with dark curls and feet bare from long walking. He carried a satchel, and inside, nestled among berries and nuts, was a single folded cloth, one Lyra had made many moons ago. "My grandmother gave this to my mother," he said, "and now she's gone, and I came to find you." Lyra crouched beside him, her voice a whisper. "Why, little one?" He hesitated. "I want to learn." And just like that, the current grew stronger. His name was Eli. He did not speak much, but he watched everything. His hands were small but nimble. He listened with his eyes more than his ears. Lyra began with the quietest lesson, patience, not in words, but in the rhythm of combing the fibers, in the stillness of waiting for the right moment to twist, to knot, to weave. She showed him how to sit by the river and observe how water moved around stones, and how threads must move the same way, never forcing, only flowing. He smiled more with each day, and every evening they sat together beside the fire, the loom between them like a shared song. Then one day, as the valley warmed into full bloom, a visitor came. She wore a cloak of red bark fiber and carried a satchel made of reeds. Her name was Maela, and she came from a far-off place called Elun. "I've heard of your cloth," she said to Lyra, her voice kind but curious. "They say it doesn't wear thin, that it breathes, that it remembers." Lyra said nothing at first. She offered tea, a bowl of roots, a place by the fire. Later, as dusk fell and the stars blinked awake, she unwrapped one of her woven cloths and placed it gently into Maela's hands. Maela traced its edge. Her fingers paused at the uneven stitches, at the small flaws that Lyra no longer tried to hide. "It feels alive," Maela whispered. "It's made to care for those who carry it," Lyra replied. Maela stayed 3 nights. Each morning she walked the valley. She watched villagers wrapping Lyra's cloth around old wounds, around newborns, around food offerings left for the forest. On the final evening, Maela turned to Lyra and said, "This isn't just cloth. This is remembering. It is prayer without sound. May I learn?" Lyra did not hesitate. She welcomed Maela to sit beside her, just as she had welcomed Eli. She showed her the fibers, the tools, the stillness. It was then Lyra understood. The current was not meant to carry her away from the valley. It was meant to carry her work outward through the hands of others. So she began to teach, not as a master, not with rules, but with stories, with pauses, with touches of the loom and silence that let the wind speak. Words spread slowly, gently, like seeds carried by breeze. And in time, more came. A soft-spoken girl from the hills who wove the wind into every thread. A healer from the riverlands who used Lyra's cloth to wrap herbs. An old basket maker who taught Lyra how to braid reeds in return. They sat in circles. They shared warm drinks. They hummed songs without names. Each one left with thread in their hands and softness in their hearts. But Lyra never stopped weaving. Even when others learned, even when her cloth was traded across forests and beyond rivers, she still rose each morning, gathered the fibers from the fields, combed them by firelight, and wove them by the rhythm of her breath. She didn't chase legacy. She didn't crave renown. She simply followed the quiet current, the one that flowed through every human need, the longing to be held, to be warm, to be remembered. One evening, Eli, now taller, stronger, older, sat beside her as she wove. He asked, "Do you ever wonder where your first cloth is now?" Lyra smiled softly. "No, I know where it is." Eli blinked. "Where?" She looked up at the stars, at the quiet sky that had watched her from the beginning. "It's everywhere," she said. "In every thread made sense, in every hand that weaves gently, in every heart that chooses care." And Eli, who had once arrived with nothing but a thread of cloth and hope, nodded. He understood now. The first cloth had never been just a cloth. It had been the beginning of a way of being. The world beyond the valley did not change all at once, but quietly, like a soft rain falling over dry earth, It began to listen. At first, it was just a handful of people, travelers who had passed through the valley and taken a thread of Lyra's cloth with them. It hung from satchels, tied around walking staffs, or stitched gently into the hems of cloaks, small, unnoticed by most, but not by everyone. In a desert village where the sun cracked the soil by midday, an elder woman named Tima began to experiment with a new way of spinning plant fibers, inspired by the smooth softness of a scrap she'd been given by a passing healer. She wove her threads not in tight knots, but in open, breathing loops. Her village, long weary of the coarse mats that irritated skin and wore quickly, began to seek out her new fabrics. They called them the Whisper Weaves. Tima never met Lyra, but she spoke her name like a prayer. In the far northern marshes, where the wind whipped hard and cold, a boy named Jalen stitched his mother's shawl using a braid technique passed to him by a traveling basket maker who had once learned beside Lyra's fire. Jalen's shawls were different, less about beauty, more about feeling. They wrapped warmth not only around the body, but deep into the soul. Those who wore them said the cold felt less cruel. Not because it changed, they would whisper, but because I did. So it was that Lyra's philosophy traveled faster than her name, not by fame, not by title, but through shared hands, quiet stories, and gentle cloths that refused to harm even the smallest child's skin. Cloth makers who once competed in markets began leaving small tokens for one another: extra thread, clean fiber, a soft smile. It was said that anyone who worked in the Lyran way never weaved with anger in their heart. If they did, the thread would twist on itself, forming knots that could not be unwound. And oddly, it was true. In the mountain town of Karun, high above the fogs, a group of elders gathered for what they believed would be the last winter of their weaving circle. Their hands had grown tired, their eyesight dim. Then one evening, a young girl arrived. She brought no tools, only a square of cloth with a small, careful stitch, made by Eli. She sat among the elders, not to teach, but to listen, to gather their stories, not just their skills. And as she listened, the elders began to weave again, not for market, not for legacy, but for the joy of remembering, for the comfort of feeling their hands create once more. They called her Wind's Thread, because she carried memories from one place to another, never asking for anything but time.
Back in the valley, Lyra no longer taught often. Her hands had grown slower, and she now spent many mornings in silence beneath the same tree where she had once first combed flax. Visitors still came, some with questions, others with thanks. They brought her cloths from far-off places, woven with strange patterns, new dyes, different wefts, but each one carried a softness she recognized, not in texture, but in intention. They had been made with care. She would touch each cloth gently, close her eyes, and say the same thing every time. Yes, this thread remembers. And so the tradition grew. In quiet corners of forests and dry hillsides, beneath the roofs of simple huts and the shade of great temples, people began to gather, not just to weave, but to share, to sit without hurry, to ask, "What do you need today?" before beginning their work, to believe that gentleness was not weakness, but wisdom. Cloth became more than a tool. It became message, comfort, heritage. Mothers wrapped newborns not just in warmth, but in stories. Healers tied gentle threads around the wrists of the sick, believing it gave courage. Even warriors carried tiny scraps sewn into the linings of their armor, not for protection of the body, but for memory of home, of calm, of care. No one could say where it had started. Not everyone even knew the name Lyra, but in every region where the thread had touched, the same phrase echoed: soft hands, strong hearts. And so it spread, not by force, not by decree, but as all lasting things do, quietly, naturally, gently. One evening, Eli stood on a distant shore. The sea stretched before him, unfamiliar and vast. In his satchel he carried a bundle of thread, flax seeds, and 3 small pieces of cloth, one from Lyra, one from Maela, and one he had woven himself. Beside him, a young woman named Irene adjusted the strap of her loom. She had come from the desert to bring cloth to lands that knew little of it. Eli turned to her and said, "Do you think they'll understand?" She smiled softly. "It's not for them to understand all at once. It's for them to feel." And together they stepped onto the boat, sails lifting like quiet breath, bound for a new land. The thread, it seemed, had no end, only beginnings, woven again and again across time and soil and soul.
Far beyond the edge of familiar valleys and sunlit hills, past forests that whispered old names, and rivers that had long since forgotten their source, there lay a land where weaving was unknown. Its people were thoughtful, proud, and still. They lived among stone, smooth, cold, and unyielding. Their homes were carved from mountains, their beds lined with hardened moss. Their clothing was stiff, layers of bark shaped and scraped into form, practical, enduring, but not soft. In this land, gentleness was not prized. It was often confused with weakness. Hands that trembled were hidden. Words spoken slowly were dismissed. They believed strength lay in silence, and survival came only through firmness. No one weaved. No one saw the point. Until, one day, they saw a sail. A boat, smaller than most, made not from hardwood, but from layered reed and cloth, drifted gently onto their stony shore. From it stepped Eli and Irene. They carried no weapons, no tools of trade, just their bundles of thread, seeds, and silence. The villagers gathered to meet them, their eyes cautious. They watched the way Irene's shawl moved in the breeze, light, rippling, alive. It unsettled them. Things were not meant to move unless told to. Eli bowed deeply, pressing a small piece of cloth into the palm of the elder who approached. It was pale, unassuming, woven with the thread of the original flax, made by Lyra's own hands. The elder turned it over, unimpressed. "It bends," he said. "Yes," Eli replied, smiling, "so it doesn't break." The villagers said nothing. They turned away, leaving Eli and Irene alone. For 3 days they were offered no shelter. They slept beneath a ledge of rock, their fire small and their food plain. Irene did not complain. She spent the mornings spinning quietly, the evenings braiding loose thread into tiny birds she left near the paths. On the 4th day, a child appeared. He didn't speak. He only watched. Irene placed a finished threadbird into his hand. He didn't smile, but he didn't leave.
The next morning, there were 5 children. By the 7th morning, the elder returned, not alone, but with a group of stoneworkers, healers, and parents. He stood before the strangers and asked, "Why thread? Why softness?" Eli looked around at the stone buildings, the rigid garments, the tired eyes. And he said gently, "Because even stone forgets warmth." They were allowed to stay. Not welcomed, not yet, but permitted. Eli offered to show how to grow flax, how to harvest without destroying, how to dry it, comb it, and spin. The villagers watched, arms folded, but a few tried. Their hands were clumsy, too used to chisels and strain. The thread snapped, the combs tangled. They scowled. Then one of the children, the same boy from before, took a thread and wrapped it around his wrist. It held. It didn't hurt. He smiled. And something shifted. Over the next moon cycle, curiosity grew. Iron showed them how to dip fibers in flower dye, how to braid cloth with intent. She explained that each loop could carry a wish, a memory, or even forgiveness. Some laughed, but others stayed late into the night, their hands now moving more gently. The elder's wife, who had long suffered from a rigid illness in her joints, was given a cloth wrap by Iron. It was light but warm. For the first time in months, she slept through the night. In the morning, she whispered, "The cloth remembers my peace." And slowly, the village began to remember its softness too.
Not all accepted the change. One craftsman known for his ironwork confronted Eli. "Your threads will not build walls. They will not guard us." Eli nodded. "They won't. Then what do they do?" Eli stepped closer, holding up a piece of cloth, simple and plain. "They carry what you build back home. They wrap the tired. They wipe the tears. They cover the newborn. They soften the world, just enough that we can stay kind in it." The craftsman said nothing more, but he was seen that night sewing his daughter's first wrap. By the end of the season, a new loom had been built, crafted of stone, wood, and love. And at its base was carved the words in the old tongue, "To soften is not to surrender." The elder, once wary, now sat beside the loom daily, tying short ribbons and teaching children how to weave their names into cloth. He told them stories of the thread that crossed the sea, of a woman named Lyra who once spun hope from fiber, and of a valley where weaving was born not from war or riches, but from stillness, from noticing, from care. And so another land was changed, not conquered, not persuaded, but offered a mirror. In it they saw what they had forgotten, not weakness, but the power of gentleness. And the cloth carried on, over another hill, into another heart. Because even still hands, once warmed, remember how to move. The time had come. The valley of still hands had learned to move with grace. Its people, once rigid in silence, now gathered each dusk with soft cloths draped across their shoulders, signs of memory, of warmth, of change. Eli stood at the edge of the village square beside Erin, gazing beyond the distant ridgelines and the river that wound like a silver thread between the stones. "I think," Eli whispered, "we must go further." Erin nodded, though her eyes stayed on the children weaving birds of thread in the shade of the loom. "We've taught all we can here," she said softly. "Now we carry her voice onward." They embraced without words, and as morning mist curled around their ankles, they parted, each with a satchel of flax seeds, strands of Lyra's first thread, and a quiet promise that they would return. Eli followed the gulls. He walked until the soil gave way to sand, until the earth smelled of salt and the air was full of rhythm. Boats dotted the horizon, curved like crescent moons, carrying people who fished not with nets, but with songs. These were the wind talkers, an island folk whose voices could bend the flight of birds, call dolphins from the waves, and calm storms with lullabies. But they did not weave. Clothing here was crafted from seagrass and hardened kelp, woven loosely with shells. The garments shimmered, but scratched the skin. Their sails tore often, and nothing wrapped their infants at night. When Eli arrived, they thought him mute. He spoke so slowly. But when he showed them cloth that breathed, cloth that whispered instead of rasped, they fell quiet. One singer, old and blind, took the cloth and placed it to his cheek. He sighed. "This listens," he said. They welcomed Eli then. He taught them how to grow flax in raised driftwood beds filled with sand and composted sea moss. He showed how fibers soaked in salt water behaved differently, stronger, crisper. They experimented with dyes made from crushed coral and sea berries. The wind talkers began to weave, but not like the valley folk. Their cloths sang. They tied threads into melodies, braiding rhythms between warp and weft. Sailcloths began to hum in the wind. Scarves echoed lullabies. Even the wraps for newborns held murmured heartbeats woven in. One child, wrapped in such a cloth, didn't cry for 3 days. The sea grew calmer that week. Eli smiled quietly. He had not only brought cloth, he had learned to listen in return. And when the boats set sail once more, their sails bore not just strength, but song.
Far to the north, Irene climbed. The road turned from dust to gravel, then stone. The winds carried the scent of cold pine and old ash. She passed silent watchtowers, ruins of villages abandoned long before warmth returned to the world. At last she came to Stonecrest. Here women ruled, not with crowns, but with silence. The Highland matrons bore iron staffs and cloaks of thick wool beaten into shape. No color adorned their halls. Words were measured. Smiles were rare. Their people knew the world could fracture at any time, and they lived prepared for it. They did not understand why Irene carried bundles of thread and a loom carved from ash. But she stayed. They gave her a hut near the goat fields and left her alone. Each day she spun by the hearth, weaving with a patience so deep it unsettled the guards. She placed scraps of finished cloth on their doorsteps. None returned. Until, one morning, during a snowstorm, a small girl knocked at her door. She did not speak. She only held up a strip of cloth Irene had left the night before, now wrapped around her doll. The girl sat down and began to braid. From then on, each evening, more came. First the girls, then the boys, then the matrons watched from the shadows. Irene did not ask them to soften. Instead, she showed how even the hardest mountain must erode to feed the valley. She spun thread into wool. She mixed flax with local goat fiber, creating a fabric that warmed even when wet. She wove names into cloaks, not loudly, but hidden between the folds. She taught the people that gentleness could live inside strength. One night, an avalanche swept through the outer trail. 3 searchers returned safe, wrapped in cloaks made by Irene's students, cloth that breathed, cloth that bent and did not tear. The high matron approached her then. She touched Irene's loom and said, "Not all softness is surrender." It was the only thing she ever said to her. But the next winter, the babies of Stonecrest were wrapped in flax-lined blankets dyed with heather. Even the snow seemed to hush in gratitude. Eli and Irene did not write letters. They had no need. Each time they touched a strand of Lyra's thread, they knew the other still wove. And across the lands they touched, new weavers rose, each with their own songs, their own colors, their own reason for bending the thread. But they all carried her spirit. Lyra, the quiet woman who once whispered to the fields and stitched kindness into the world, now lived in cloaks that sang, shawls that cradled, and robes that remembered. Even those who had never heard her name wore her gentleness. And so, like water seeping into roots, the weaving spread, wordless, boundless, tender. Because true change, as Lyra had known from the start, does not arrive loudly. It is spun, thread by thread, heart by heart, and always with quiet hands.
Far to the west, past the river that forgot its name in winter, and beyond the hills that whispered only when the moon was high, there lay a village carved into stone. They called it Hollow Grove, not because it lacked trees or song, but because the stones themselves were hollowed with time and sadness. The people of Hollow Grove were stone cutters, born with the strength to chisel mountains and the silence of those who had lost much. Their ancestors had shaped temples, towers, and tombs, but never anything soft. Their hands were hard, their hearts harder still. They did not weave, they did not dance, and no one remembered the last time a child was born laughing. But then, one day, something strange arrived in their square. It wasn't a merchant, it wasn't a priest. It was a young woman in a pale traveling cloak, with eyes the color of weathered bark, and a bundle wrapped in flax linen upon her back. Her name was Emra. She had been a student of Lyra, and she had come to teach the stone village how to weave. The first refusal. The elders gathered beneath the great arch of the silent square. They looked down from their seats of stone, their robes as gray as the cliffs they once carved. "We do not weave," said the eldest, voice echoing as if from within a cave. "We shape what lasts. Stone remembers, thread does not." Emra bowed. "Stone remembers," she agreed, "but stone does not comfort." The crowd stirred. It wasn't defiance in her tone. It was something else, something softer. "Stone can hold the names of the dead," she continued, "but thread can cradle the living." A murmur, a pause. A door creaked open in the back of the crowd. A child peered out, hair wild, eyes curious. Her name was Yalin, though no one had spoken it aloud in some time. Emra smiled at the child, and then, before anyone could object, she sat down on the bare stone and began to weave. Emra's loom was small, worn with travel. Her hands moved slowly, unhurried. Her first threads were earthy browns and pale brays,
colors of Hollow Grove itself. She did not try to speak over the silence. She wove with it. Each day she sat in the square, weaving in silence. Each night she left a piece of cloth hanging from the archway, one for sorrow, one for memory, one for forgiveness. Some were taken. No one admitted it, but the cloths vanished by morning. One day a man approached her. He was tall, with deep lines across his brow. Hadric, the stonecutter who'd buried 2 sons. He knelt beside her, not speaking. She passed him a shuttle of thread, storm blue, the color of morning. He did not know how to weave, but he stayed. The next day his wife came too, then an apprentice, then a girl with shaking hands. And Emra taught them, not with words, but with gesture, rhythm, and patience.
Among the many things Hollow Grove had carved were graves, hundreds, rows and rows of names in neat stone-lined gardens. But the gardens had no flowers, and the names were never visited. So Emra proposed something new. "We will weave a blanket," she said, "one square for each name, one color for each memory." The villagers hesitated. But then, quietly, Hadric stepped forward. He began with the name of his eldest son, Seren, and chose the color dusk purple because Seren loved to watch the stars. One by one, others followed. Gray for a mother who sang lullabies near the hearth. Ochre for a child who loved the autumn leaves. Soft green for a friend who never came back from the river. When the blanket was finished, it covered half the square. It was not loud, it was not perfect, but it was held together by hands that had never dared to remember. And the silence that followed was no longer empty. As seasons changed, so did Hollow Grove. No one stopped carving stone, but now at market, stalls of thread and cloth appeared beside those of granite and chisel. Scarves lined the archways. Children wore sashes woven in laughter and mischief. One old man, a sculptor who'd sworn never to touch anything but marble, began to weave thin ribbons of colored thread into the folds of his statues. "It's for the wind," he explained simply, "so they don't feel so alone." Visitors from distant places came to ask, how did stone become soft? And the answer was always whispered. A girl came and listened. She wove until our hearts remembered how. Before she left, Emra gathered the villagers beneath the arch. In her hands, she held a square of cloth, simple, light gray, with a single golden thread down the center. "This," she said, "is not a gift. It is a promise." She tied the cloth to the top of a slender stone pillar. "If you ever forget how to be soft, come here, touch it, and begin again." To this day, that cloth still flutters in the wind, threadbare, yes, but never gone. And each spring, when the first rains come and the village smells of wet stone and fresh thread, the children run to the square and shout, "The soft has stayed."
Long after Lyra had faded into memory, and her students had become legends whispered beside hearths and marketplaces, there arose a traveler with eyes full of questions and hands that had never woven a single thing. His name was Ciro, and he was not a weaver. He was a listener, a collector of stories. But there was one story that had haunted him since childhood, told to him by an old woman in a riverside village, a story of a single thread spun from the gentlest stalk of flax, drawn beneath the moonlight by hands that trembled not from fear, but from love. The first thread, she had said, was not spun from plant nor wool, but from a wish the earth whispered into Lyra's palm.
Ciro, now grown and weathered by years of wandering, could no longer sleep without hearing that whisper. And so, with nothing but a satchel, a walking stick, and a heart full of quiet wonder, he set out to find it. The first thread. He began his journey where Lyra's story had first begun, the fields of flax, now golden and swaying beneath soft clouds. Old farmers greeted him kindly, offering bread, blankets, and stories. "She used to walk through here barefoot," said one, "so the earth would teach her what the roots were saying." Ciro walked barefoot too, listening. He followed the trail of her footsteps, not marked on any map, but found in gentle traditions. A child offering a blanket to a stranger. A mother weaving sorrow into a scarf and warmth into its fringe. Every village he entered, he found pieces, not of the thread, but of its spirit. And yet, the thread itself remained elusive. Part 2. The Forest of Lost Patterns. His path took him into the deep woodlands, where old weavers once said Lyra rested under canopies of green, listening to the loom song of leaves. The forest was thick with silence, but not the cold kind. It was the silence of something remembering. In a clearing, Ciro found an old hut crumbling with age. Inside, a loom, its frame worn smooth by time and hands now long returned to soil. And in a corner, curled beneath dried moss and forgotten yarns, was a thread. Thin, faded, almost invisible. He touched it, carefully. And though it was not the first thread, it was a first for someone. A young woman named Erlon had once spun it here, years after Lyra had gone, inspired by a story and a dream. Ciro smiled and gently wound the piece onto a spool. "Not the thread," he whispered, "but a part of its echo." He continued. Atop the cold hills of the north, where few dared climb, he found old Darren, a former student of Emra, now nearly blind, but still weaving. "I've searched for the thread," Ciro told him, "the first one, Lyra's." Darren laughed gently, voice like a dry wind brushing through wool. "Child," he said, "what makes you think it still exists?" Ciro paused. "Because everyone who's touched her story leaves something behind." The old man nodded. "Then it does exist. Not in one place, but in many, like starlight scattered in a lake." But Ciro still longed to touch it, to see it with his eyes, not just his heart. Darren thought for a while. Then he pointed to the east. "There is a lake they say she wept beside. Go there. If the thread sleeps anywhere still, it would be in the place where she let go." The lake had no name. It was a still mirror, undisturbed by bird or breeze. Ciro arrived near nightfall. He sat in silence, listening. And as the stars blinked into being, he saw something near the water's edge, half buried in reed and soil. He reached down with reverence. There, wrapped in a cloth that had nearly turned to dust, was a tiny bobbin. Upon it, one fragile, silver-blonde strand remained. It shimmered in the moonlight, not with magic, but with memory. Ciro wept, not because he had found the thread, but because he understood now it was never meant to be kept, only carried and shared. Ciro never claimed he'd found the first thread, but he returned with threads from many hands, from children who learned to weave joy, from widows who stitched grief into warmth, from strangers who wrapped the ill in comfort. He spun them all together, not tightly, but gently, a tapestry of lives touched by Lyra's legacy. And at the center, he placed the silver thread from the lake, its end frayed, its story unfinished. He hung the tapestry in a hall made of open doors, where people came not to worship, but to rest and to dream. When people asked Zero, "Did you find it?" he smiled and answered softly, "Yes, and so can you."
The rains had returned to the valley where Lyra once walked, soft and slow, like fingers brushing the earth's forehead. In a nearby village, a young girl named Nemea stood in front of a woven cloth that fluttered gently in the wind. It was plain, pale like moonlight, beautiful in its simplicity. But something stirred within her, a longing, a question. Can cloth remember joy? She asked her grandmother, an old spinner named Tala, who sat beneath the eaves spinning flax with her weathered hands. Tala smiled softly, "Only if we let it wear the sky." And so it began, with a handful of indigo leaves grown wild beside the stream. Nemea boiled them gently in a clay pot, adding nothing but patience and a wooden stick for stirring. The water turned deep as twilight. She lowered the cloth in slowly, her fingers trembling not from fear, but wonder. The transformation was silent, and when she lifted it out, blue. A blue that shimmered like the horizon at dawn. It wasn't just a color. It was a memory. Of her mother's voice singing in the morning. Of running barefoot after birds across the fields. Of tears that had no weight. Nemea wrapped the cloth around her shoulders and smiled. The cloth now remembers with me. Word of the colored cloth spread gently, like a lullaby hummed through hills. Another villager, a boy named Talrin, came to Nemea one evening. "My brother is going to war," he whispered. "Can cloth carry hope?" Nemea thought for a moment, then nodded. Together they crushed the petals of wild madder root, rich and red as dusk. The dye stained their fingers and filled the pot with the scent of soil and warmth. When they drew the cloth from the pot, it glowed red, not harsh or loud, but steady, like the beat of a heart refusing to forget. Talrin folded the cloth into a square and placed it into his brother's satchel. "This," he said, "will remind him to come back." Not all dyeing brought joy. An old widow, Mila, came to Nemea with a shawl her daughter once wore. "She is gone now," she said softly, "but I want the wind to remember her warmth." Together, they ground the heads of wildflowers, their yellow glow sharp like noonlight in summer. The shawl took on a golden hue, not bright, but soft, like sunshine seen through half-closed eyes. When Mila placed it around her shoulders, she didn't cry, but her breath caught. And for the first time in many months, she hummed a tune. The cloth didn't erase grief. It held it, gently. In time, more people came, and more plants revealed their secrets. Elderberries for purple, oak bark for gray, lichen for soft greens like moss in morning. Each color carried its own memory, its own truth. And soon, cloth was no longer just for covering skin or warming bodies. It became language. It became song. Weavers wove with colors the way poets wove with words. A robe for a healer with threads of forest green and twilight silver. A baby's blanket dyed in rosewater and honey mint. A mourning veil the color of deep river stones, comforting in its silence. Nemea never claimed to have invented dyeing. She said only, "I asked the plants what they remembered, and they shared it."
And thus began a tradition across the known lands, that no cloth be left silent, that every thread be given the chance to carry something sacred, a laugh, a goodbye, a promise. In time, colors became more than beautiful. They became trustworthy. When someone wore a blue scarf, others knew it meant peace. When a red shawl passed hands, it carried courage. And when a yellow flag flew above a house, it said, "This home remembers." Years later, an elder pilgrim, Sero himself, visited Nemia's village long after her passing. He stood in awe before her final creation, a long tapestry of every shade found in earth and sky, with a thread of Lyra silver running gently down the center. The colors did not dazzle, they whispered. And Sero, now gray and slow, smiled through quiet tears. "Even silence," he said, "can wear color when we listen." The wind across the hills was quieter now. It no longer howled with the hunger of winter, nor whispered the sharp breath of autumn. It was spring, and with it came not only new shoots and soft petals, but the first steps of travelers carrying something more delicate than bread, salt, or song. They carried cloth, not just to wear, but to offer. A young weaver from Nemia's village, Talan, grandson of Tala, decided one morning to cross the hills into a land whispered to be unfriendly, even cruel. "They do not weave," someone warned. "They wear skins and bones," said another. "They won't understand," his uncle said. But Talon smiled. A gift doesn't ask to be understood. It only asks to be accepted. In his satchel was a folded square of sky-blue cloth woven with soft gold edges. No embroidery, no sigils, just calm, just light. He walked for 3 days. He was greeted by silence, then suspicion, and then by a woman named Jira, who watched him from behind a wooden gate. She spoke no word of his tongue. But when he unfolded the cloth and offered it with open hands, something ancient stirred in her memory. She touched it, then looked at the sky, then nodded, and took it inside. From that day, something shifted in the villages near the borders. Cloth, dyed, plain, textured, patterned, began to move. Not in markets, not through price, but through trust. A hunter gave a crimson wrap to a wounded stranger found in the forest. A child offered a green sash to a lonely widow at the edge of her town. A midwife placed a soft lavender kerchief in the hands of a birthing mother she barely knew. It was not barter. It was bridge building. There was once a village known as Delkar, nestled between cliffs, with no flax fields, no sheep, and no loom. They carved stone, cooked root vegetables, and told their history by firelight. They had no use for cloth, until a merchant from the west arrived, weary and shivering, and fell asleep at their gates. They gave him soup and rest. When he awoke, he gave them a simple scarf, woven of dusk gray and fern green. It meant nothing to them at first, until, one night, a young boy wrapped it around his shoulders and said, "It feels like someone remembered me." Delkar did not learn to weave, but they learned to cherish. And soon their trade goods, stone tools, salts, carvings, were exchanged for cloth with emotion, with meaning. They didn't wear cloth for warmth. They wore it to remember kindness. The cloth made it to the coastal tribes next. Sailors tied ribbons dyed in coral pink around their masts before long journeys.
Children wore bands of seafoam green when their fathers were away. Fishermen stitched woven symbols, waves, birds, hands, into tiny satchels worn on the wrist, kissed by loved ones before they set sail. Cloth no longer stayed on land. It began to sail, and wherever it arrived, it carried whispers of warmth. There is a tale, rare and quietly passed, of a skirmish halted by cloth. Two tribes long at odds met at the riverbanks in bitter tension. But before swords could rise, a child ran between them with a fluttering white cloth stitched with silver leaves. No words, no plea, only presence. The soldiers lowered their weapons slowly. One elder, old enough to remember Lyra's name, stepped forward and whispered, "This is not ours to spill blood on." They sat. A meal was shared, and the cloth, later named the peacefold, was placed in a shrine of stone and river shells, never again to be worn, only to be remembered. In time, there were stories of weavers who wove for strangers, not for trade, not for fame, but because they believed someone, somewhere, needed softness. A blanket left in a cave for a traveler. A wrap sent on a boat with no name, only hope. A sash tied to a tree where a lost child might pass. They never knew where their work ended up, but they smiled anyway. Not all gifts need eyes to see them delivered, one weaver said. They only need heart. And so, cloth moved faster than war, softer than steel. It crossed hills, seas, deserts, and language. It became a way of saying what the mouth could not, a way of holding someone across a distance, of apologizing without shame, of welcoming without pride, of giving for no reason but the joy of giving. And somewhere in the breeze that brushed through every woven thread, there lingered a whisper that only the gentlest ears could hear. This began with a girl who listened to the silence of flax. There are songs that no one ever sing aloud. They do not begin with a voice. They begin with a memory, a feeling, a thread. And in the years that followed Lyra's passing, as weaving spread and cloth moved from hand to heart, a quiet shift began among the weavers. They no longer wove only to cover. They wove to remember, to bless, to speak without sound. In the hill village of Norvan, where mist touched the rooftops each dawn, a group of women began to hum softly as they wove. Each rhythm matched the movement of their hands. And soon they noticed something peculiar. If they thought of someone while they wove, a loved one, a moment, a dream, the cloth felt different. A blanket for a newborn carried warmth that lingered. A scarf for a grieving father seemed to hold his shoulders. And when asked how they knew what to weave, they said simply, "The thread tells us. We listen." A young girl named Miel, born deaf but radiant with light, was the first to name it, Thread Song. She could not hear the weaver's hums, but she said she could feel them in the cloth. Each piece carried a rhythm, like footsteps on the earth or wind across grass. Miel began collecting scraps and pinning them together in long, ribboned books. She gave them titles: Grandmother's Prayer, The Storm Before We Met, Laughter by the Hearth. People came from afar to see her collection, and they didn't just look. They closed their eyes and listened, not with ears, but with something deeper.
and they felt the cloth sing. In the quiet moments before sleep, many weavers began a new tradition. They called it nightfall weaving. They would light a small candle, sit alone, and weave a few inches, thinking only of the day gone by. No patterns, no dye, just raw fiber softened by thought. These night weaves were never sold, never gifted. They were folded and stored beside the bed or beneath the pillow. And it was said that sleeping near them brought deeper dreams, more restful breath, and sometimes, if one listened closely, a dream would whisper the very memory woven within.
There came a time when memory began to fade in the minds of the elderly, but their hands still remembered how to weave. And so families began a practice. When a loved one grew forgetful, their family would bring the loom. And as the elder wove, slowly, quietly, a story returned. A scent, a face, a song. One old man, Orrin, who hadn't spoken in 2 years, suddenly murmured, "This is the sky the day she said yes to me." They held the cloth to their hearts, and the family wept, not from sorrow, but from finding something they thought was lost. The threads remembered, even when the mind forgot. In the rainy town of Selka, a young widow wove only at dusk. Her cloths were never sold or shown. They were often dark in hue, deep blues, mossy greens, ashen grays. People called them mourning cloths. But one night, a traveler lost in the storm knocked at her door. He was soaked, shivering, and near collapse. She said nothing. She gave him tea and wrapped one of her scarves around his shoulders. The next morning, he asked, "How did you know I carried grief?" She replied, "I didn't, but the thread always finds its echo." He wept and left the scarf tied to a tree near the crossroads for another soul who might need it. Not every thread song needed a reason. Some weavers wove simply for the joy of the rhythm, the softness beneath their fingers, the hush of spinning wheels, and the sigh of fiber breathing into shape. Children in the village of Aielu began crafting tiny woven squares, just a palm in size, and hiding them in tree hollows, under mossy stones, or between the pages of books in the village library. They called them pocket songs. No two were alike, and when found, they were kept, not for use, but for the strange, serene feeling they gave. A stillness, a knowing, as if someone had been there before you, thinking kindly of you, even if they'd never met you. It is said that one day, far from her village, one of Lyra's original woven cloths was discovered buried beneath a collapsed shrine. Time had dulled the colors, but the thread was intact, and when a weaver named Nalin touched it, she fainted, not from fright, but from sensation. She whispered later, "It was like hearing every lullaby I was ever sung," she whispered later, like a voice made of moonlight, saying, "Rest now." The cloth was not placed in a museum. It was not cut or copied. It was laid across a simple wooden bench in the community weaving hall. And every weaver who came was allowed to sit beside it, close their eyes, and listen. As the years passed, the world grew louder. New tools, new trade, new distractions. But in small corners, beside candles, behind cottages, beneath trees, people still wove. Not for fashion, not for coin, but for quiet, for memory, for the song in the thread. And when you wear something made from such cloth, if you slow your breath, if you rest your hand lightly upon it,
You may just hear it too. Not in your ears, but in your chest, in your soul. A soft lullaby, woven from love, carried from long ago, whispering, "You are remembered." There are things too fragile for speech, things too sacred for ink, but the loom remembers them all. For even before letters found their shapes, the loom had already learned how to write. Long before alphabets, in the wide valley of Tessera, people noticed something strange. A woven sash worn by a mother in mourning looked different from that of a bride. Not in texture, but in color, in knot, in feel. One elder began to name the patterns. 3 loops for sorrow, waves for hope returning, red diamonds for a promise fulfilled. Soon, messages no longer needed messengers. A cloth tied to a branch said, "We are safe." The harvest was kind. A shawl hung in the wind whispered, "He has not returned." A belt woven with sunbursts and green thread meant, "A child has been born. She lives." Villages began reading the fields, not for crops, but for cloth. The land had become a library. In the cliffside town of Aru, where the ocean sang beneath caves, lived an old woman named Tamina, called the Knot Keeper. She could not read scrolls, but her fingers had memorized over 400 knots, each with meaning. To tie a message, she didn't speak, she wove. Her fingers danced, and the message was born in silence. A triple twist at the hem might mean, "Stay, danger ahead." A left-right braid with a pulled loop meant, "Come quietly, love waits." Her woven cords were passed in pockets, around wrists, tied to doors. And Tamina always said, "Words are carried by wind, knots stay in the palm." In the sun-washed meadows of Emerald, children played with color like songbirds. They were the first to blend thread and motion to create a woven dance. They'd carry small ribbons dyed with plants, indigo for dreams, yellow for good fortune, gray for unanswered questions. As they danced, they tied ribbons into long braids, sometimes into one another's hair or into tree branches. Each combination meant something different. When one child moved away, they left behind a ribbon with 7 knots and 2 feathers. The others knew, "I'll miss you every week, but I'll fly back someday." Thus, memory was not just held, it was performed. In a desert monastery built from salt and silence, monks did not speak for 7 years at a time. But their looms were loud. They kept daily cloth journals, strips no wider than a hand, marked with tiny signs. Black stitch for illness, silver thread for clarity, a missing loop for sorrow, an extra knot for joy unexpected. Over decades, these strips were bound into long rolls, some longer than the halls themselves. And when a monk passed away, the community would wrap his body not with words from a sermon, but with his own woven life. Every thread a footstep, every knot a heartbeat. In the snowy northern land of Kir, weavers developed what many believe to be the first true alphabet of cloth. It had 18 basic patterns, 3 types of tension, 2 kinds of edge finishings. By combining these, they could write full messages in cloth, readable only by trained weavers. Traders used this system to send silent warnings through decorative rugs. Storms coming, delay your travel. Offer peace, their grief is fresh.
Do not trust the one who brings wine. It became known as thread script. Children in Kir grew up learning to read rugs like books, running their fingers across them before bedtime. And to this day, many homes in Kir still hang one such rug by the door, just in case a guest brings more than words. As the language of cloth grew, scholars and weavers alike returned to study the original pieces made by Lyra. Hidden in her folds were repeating symbols: a spiral for patience, a triangle for listening, a square within a square for resilience. She had not intended it, but her soul had written its own alphabet. It was not perfect, it was not planned, but it was real, and it spoke still. Gentleness is not silence, it is another kind of speaking. By now, the loom was no longer just a tool. It had become a library, a diary, a shrine, a love letter, a warning, a lullaby. In homes across mountains, deserts, and islands, people sat beside their looms not only to make cloth, but to tell stories the wind would never carry away. Cloth that meant, "I forgive you." Cloth that meant, "Come home." Cloth that meant, "I remember." And so, long before ink or stone or paper, the world learned to write with thread.
Nestled between silver birch trees and quiet hills, there was a hidden village called Augem, known not for its warriors or wealth, but for its stillness. The people there did not shout. They did not hurry. Even laughter was soft, as though carried on feathered wings. Here, the weavers made healing cloth. These were not grand tapestries or shimmering gowns. They were small, humble things. A strip of cotton laid across the brow of a grieving mother. A shawl for the elderly, woven with dusk-colored thread. A wrap for children afraid of storms. What made them special was not the thread, but the silence in which they were made. Each stitch was a prayer, whispered, never spoken aloud. Let this cloth hold what they cannot say. Let this cloth rest where pain will not. They say it began with a child who would not stop crying. No reason could be found, no injury, no fever. Her eyes stayed open all night, wide with shadows. Then an elder, Lani, wove her a soft square of flax and nettle. As she did, she hummed an old song, one without words, just breath rising and falling like ocean waves. She wrapped the cloth around the child's chest. The crying stopped, and in the quiet that followed, everyone heard it. A sigh, not from the child, but from the cloth itself, as though it had taken the sorrow into its threads and settled it gently between fibers. From that day, Lani's cloths were sought by many, not as miracles, but as comfort. They do not cure, she would say, but they remember what was forgotten, and sometimes that is enough. Not all thread was equal. In Augem, the weavers began to experiment, quietly, patiently, with plants that seemed to respond to human touch. Lamb's ear leaves for soothing skin, calendula petals for threads that calmed the breath, hemp bark, not rough but softened by moonlight rinses, and most sacred of all, midnight flax. It grew only where no voices had been raised for 1 year. The cloth made from it shimmered faintly under starlight. Children who wore robes lined with midnight flax were said to sleep dreamlessly through storms. In the central square of Augem, there hung a single banner, long, gray, and made of interwoven sorrows. It was called the Veil of Mourning. When someone lost a loved one, they would take a small square of this veil home, not to wear, but to hold against their heart before sleep. After one moon cycle, they would return it and tie a new thread into the edge, whatever color felt closest to the sorrow. Over years, the veil changed, from gray to streaks of violet, to patches of deep green and brown, to sudden, fragile bursts of gold. And in time, the veil became not just a symbol of loss, but of survival.
On the coast of Aran's Reach, the weavers listened to a different rhythm, the tides. They discovered that when seaweed fibers were soaked with elderflower oil and spun during full moons, the cloth held warmth longer than ordinary fabric. Fishermen began to wrap their aching limbs in it. Mothers swaddled newborns in sea-woven bands, said to protect against fevers. One sailor, lost at sea for 6 nights, later said, "It was not the stars that guided me home. It was the cloth my wife had sewn into my coat. I swear, it hummed to me." All throughout the scattered villages, tales of Lyra had changed. No longer was she just the first to spin flax. She had become something more, a whisper, a warmth, a way of seeing pain not as something to fear, but to hold, gently, until it softened. Auvergne's weavers began to recreate her original loom, guided by dreams and the rhythm of the wind. They did not know its exact shape, but when it was done and the first threads passed through, birds gathered on the rooftops. The air stilled, and someone wept, not from sadness, but relief. The cloth made from this loom was not for sale. It was given to those too tired to speak, to those whose hearts had folded in on themselves. And in every fold of fabric, a quiet message was tucked away. You are not forgotten. You are not broken. You are becoming. Once a year, when the moon sat lowest in the sky, the people of Avum wove in the dark. No candles, no words. Each person worked on a square no larger than a hand. Some wove for themselves, others for someone they had lost, a few for someone they had yet to meet. In the morning, the squares were stitched together, not with thread, but with dew gathered before sunrise. The result was called the dream cloth, and when wrapped around those who could not sleep, who had lost their sense of time or purpose, it brought a deep, velvety slumber. Some say they dreamed of Lyra. Some say they dreamed of nothing. But all woke lighter.
It started slowly, like dew collecting at dawn. Villages that once had no reason to speak with one another began trading cloths, not for gold or grain, but for stories. A healer in the eastern mountains wrapped her patients in sun-stained shawls from the Saltwind coast. A child in the forests of the north clung to a pillow made from the softest wool woven by desert hands. A teacher in the river city of Coron wore a robe embroidered with quiet patterns, symbols only understood by weavers from a far-off land. Each thread, though made in a different place, spoke the same gentle language. We see you. You matter. Rest easy. And in time, these cloths became more than comfort. They became bridges. A time came when all the weaving communities, some with centuries of silence between them, gathered. They brought no weapons, no kings, no scrolls to sign. Only looms carried on backs and carts, old, new, tall, tiny. They met in a vast field where nothing had ever grown, because the soil remembered too many wars. And there they did not speak, they wove. Side by side, strangers began to pass threads to one another. A bit of nettle here, a strip of riverweed there. Goat's wool dyed with berries, linen softened by salt air. No one led. And yet, at the end of 3 days, a single cloth had formed. Long as a river, gentle as a sigh, strong as forgiveness. The wind picked it up, and it danced like a banner. But they did not hang it on a palace. They laid it on the ground, so that all who came later could walk upon it with bare feet, and know, here we are not divided by borders. We are stitched together by care. As the woven cloth became sacred, so too did the code behind it. It was not written in ink. It was passed down in patterns. A spiral meant, speak kindly, even in correction. A broken line meant, remember those who are gone. A square within a circle said, safety surrounds the vulnerable. People began to weave their promises, not write them. Couples exchanged shawls instead of rings. Judges wore robes stitched by the hands of the people they served. When leaders forgot to listen, their garments were unpicked, a silent protest more powerful than any sword. In time, these woven customs were known as the gentle law. Far away, in a field of tall grass that swayed like breath, they built something strange. No doors, no roof, only wooden beams, each strung with cloths from every region. Sea blue silks that rang with song in the breeze. Forest-dyed linens marked with quiet symbols. Wool shawls folded like the wings of resting birds. People came not to worship, but to rest. They lay on the ground, looked at the sky through fluttering cloth, and listened to what the wind whispered through threads. Sometimes they wept, sometimes they just slept. But all who left said the same thing. I feel sewn back together. And so it became known as the Temple of Mending.
War still existed, but something had changed. When soldiers from opposite sides met, sometimes one would reach into their satchel and pull out a square of cloth. Not a banner, just a soft piece of hand-woven fabric, perhaps from a mother, a sibling, or a village elder. And for reasons no one fully understood, both sides would stop, sit, and share stories. The cloth became a kind of truce, an agreement that, for a time, pain would not grow larger. Eventually, when a true peace was finally brokered across the lands, it was not sealed with a treaty scroll, but with a massive weaving, 20 feet long, created by hands of every language, every land, every past wound. No emblems, no borders, just flow and softness, and 1,000 different ways of saying, we will not forget each other. We will soften. We will rest. No one knew where Lyra had gone. Some said she had walked into the sea. Others believed she had become part of the wind. But on nights when the world was especially quiet and the looms creaked softly under starlight, some said they could hear her voice, woven between warp and weft. Spin with love, stitch with purpose, and let no thread fall without kindness. Her philosophy had spread beyond fabric. It had become a way of life. And now, dear listener, perhaps you too hold a piece of this legacy. A scarf given to you by gentle hands. A blanket wrapped around you by someone who stayed when others left. A pillow that carries the scent of home. These are not just things. They are reminders that long ago someone chose to create with tenderness. And that tenderness still echoes in every fold, every fiber. So tonight, as you rest, may you feel the warmth of 1,000 threads. May you hear the hush of ancient looms. And may you remember, you too are part of this cloth, woven, held, cherished, always.
As time passed, people no longer asked, "Who made this?" They asked, "What story is in this thread?" And each cloth, however small, however worn, answered with silence, a silence that comforted, remembered, and belonged. And in that stillness, the legacy of Lyra lived on, not in monuments, not in songs, but in softness, in warmth, in the way a simple piece of cloth could make a stranger feel safe. That, perhaps, was the greatest thread ever spun, one that weaves through generations, gently, quietly, eternally. Hello again, my dear listener. You've reached the end of tonight's story. I wonder how you feel right now. Perhaps a little calmer, a little warmer inside, as if wrapped in a quiet blanket of time. This tale we shared wasn't just about cloth or looms, but about the soft strength we carry in our own hearts, how gentleness can become something powerful, something lasting. If this story brought you even a moment of peace tonight, I'm truly grateful you stayed. I'd love to know, what kinds of stories bring you comfort? What would you like to hear next under the glow of the firelight? You can let me know in the comments, or simply tap that little like button. It helps the story reach others who may need it too. And if you haven't already, please subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell, so you'll be the first to know when a new journey begins. For now, I wish you the gentlest of nights. May your dreams be kind and your heart be light. Rest well, and remember, you are always welcome here. Good night, and until we meet again, sleep softly, and I'll see you tomorrow.